The sound of distant surf crashing against the French cliffs was drowned by gunfire and frantic shouts. Men clung to wet sand, barely breathing, unable to move even an inch forward. But behind those gray waves and the barbed confusion, far before history called it heroism, General Norman Cota stood not as a legend, but as a man who understood the sharp edge of pressure. His boots scraped Omaha Beach, but inside, his resolve was forged years earlier, in moments no camera would ever capture. Standing there, knee-deep in uncertainty, Cota's eyes reflected something that had been with him long before war: the persistent ache of financial stress, the burden of fighting for survival when the world doesn't wait for you to catch your breath. Even before bullets tore apart the tranquility of Europe, Cota's battles began in quieter rooms, at kitchen tables, and in his own weary soul. He'd been the boy who watched his parents spread worn bills across the table, the teenager waking up before dawn to earn $1 for tuition, the young officer calculating the cost of dreams against the debts they created. It's one thing to read about sacrifice and hardship in textbooks. It's another to feel your own future pressed between overdue notices and family expectation. Cota grew up where every penny mattered and every decision carried the weight of "what if I fail?" Even when he first donned a uniform, the weight of bills and the hope of his family trailed him, silent but relentless. There was no triumphant music, only the sound of him asking, time and again, "How much further can I carry this?" His story is not the one usually told. Most tales paint him as the fearless general, the man who bellowed, "Rangers, lead the way," as he walked upright through chaos, inspiring paralyzed troops to move. Yet, the real story starts before the beach, long before medals or movies. It starts in the smaller storms, the kind you and I know too well. The private panic of running short, the shame of wishing you had more, the late-night wrestling with numbers that never seemed to add up. For Cota, war was not his first taste of high stakes. Instead, he'd learned the choreography of courage in grind and scarcity, years where failure seemed closer than victory. People rarely talk about heroes and hardship in the same breath, as if one erases the other. But let's get honest. Sometimes our greatest danger is not a distant battlefield, but the unrelenting pressure in our living rooms, our bank statements, our own hearts. In the dark, financial shame feels like a private loss. We see others winning, moving, leading, while we fumble with doubts and overdue tabs, wondering why we can't seem to get unstuck. There is a particular loneliness in money problems, a hush we keep because we want so desperately to appear strong, to lead our own lives without stumbling. But underneath, beating in sync with our biggest ambitions, is that anxious pulse. If I don't figure this out, what will happen to those I love? To the future I want? No one talks about the fact that the people who lead best, who rise under fire, so often come from scarcity, not abundance. They have lived where nothing is guaranteed, and every hard choice is a matter of survival. Cota's ability to stride into danger came not from some inborn bravado, but from having already survived the collapse of his own certainty. He knew what it meant to lead with exhaustion instead of energy, to hope when all you have left is hope, to build resilience with nothing but grit. When he looked at his men on that fateful morning, frozen by fear, maybe he saw not just soldiers, but people paralyzed by different but equally punishing kinds of debt, the debts of fear, failure, and expectation. As you listen to his story, you will recognize pieces of your own journey in the shadows of his. Perhaps you are not on a war-torn shore, but your storms are real, your responsibilities heavy. Maybe your greatest battles are not with an enemy you can name, but with the voice that whispers, "You can't win this. You're in too deep." Yet something else pulses beneath that, an urge to reclaim power, to rise, to lead your own life out of the pressure that has defined it. What if the same grit that pushed Cota forward in the face of gunfire could pull you through the barrage of financial fear? This script is not about medals or myths. It's about the space between struggle and action, the raw realness of a man who once considered giving up, who then chose, despite everything, to move forward and change the story for himself and others. Together, let's walk through this journey, not just to honor one man's courage, but to uncover how, even in our hardest moments, we can step out from behind our cover and lead the way toward the life we want. Standing just inside the shadow of his modest apartment, Norman Coda's son, John, watched as his father meticulously balanced a stack of faded ledgers. The window beside them rattled in the wind, tracing lines of condensation down chipped glass. It was a childhood memory, seemingly inconsequential, but it seeded patterns that John carried unknowingly for decades. On the table, coins clinked into separate piles: rent, rations, tuition, each one representing a dream paid for in advance, or sometimes postponed indefinitely. The silence hung heavy, punctuated by only the scratch of his father's pencil. From these small domestic scenes, John unconsciously inherited more than a thrifty attitude. Without realizing, he also adopted a subtle wariness, a persistent sense that money was always in short supply and that every financial decision danced on the knife's edge between obligation and opportunity. Decades later, John sat in a university business class, laughing along with friends as textbooks circled the calculus of capital markets and profit margins. None of those glossy graphs or bold, optimistic forecasts could erase an underlying pulse. Whenever John considered an investment, a gentle, insistent doubt pricked at him. He traced this pattern back, puzzle piece by puzzle piece, to those nights watching his father fret over bills and the sacrificial shuffle for stability. While classmates embraced ideas of risk and reward with an almost reckless bravado, John often found himself quietly bracing for invisible, generational aftershocks. He didn't simply decide to be prudent. He felt compelled by the emotional currents inherited years earlier, tied together with every whispered warning about what could go wrong. Yet this phenomenon is not unique to John. All across the world, beliefs about money take root in the most ordinary places. Holiday dinners where grown-ups sigh at the mention of taxes, playground conversations about rich kids, or the way an offhand remark about not wasting follows you through a grocery store decades later. The origins of our mental scripts are not written with our permission. Rather, they're constructed in the background, brick by almost invisible brick, until they form invisible walls. Consider how your own financial self-talk borrows language from early authority figures. Even if you promise yourself, "My children will never feel deprived," you might hear an echo in your decisions, hesitation, or a drive to control every outcome, or even the vague sense that having too much is somehow suspect. A woman named Carla, for example, grew up passing hand-me-downs to her younger siblings, listening to her mother insist, "We make do." Now, as a successful real estate agent, Carla finds herself squirming when clients talk about luxury, battling feelings of guilt whenever she treats herself to something beyond necessity. She runs numbers on client deals late into the night, not just fueled by ambition, but by an instinctive need to outrun an old, inherited warning: don't be greedy, don't invite envy. Consequently, Carla's financial ceiling isn't set by her earnings, but by a subconscious thermostat meticulously calibrated by the emotional climate of her upbringing. In a strikingly different household, Jared was told, "Money is a tool. Don't get attached. Take risks." His parents embraced up and down cycles as adventures, their kitchen table littered with stories of failed ventures and near misses. As an adult, Jared adopted their language wholesale, charging into uncertain startups without ever truly weighing the long-term consequences. When setbacks arrived, he brushed off warning signs as bad luck, even as anxiety tugged at his gut each time another venture faltered. Despite boasting resilience, Jared, too, became a prisoner, not of scarcity, but of a script that prized bravado at the expense of healthy caution. What happens inside us is shaped less by logic than by these invisible blueprints. Our beliefs soak in through overheard worries, family jokes, cultural norms, and even what's left unspoken at the table. Without close examination, these beliefs quietly dictate how we respond to abundance and adversity alike, shaping whether we cling, chase, or continually sabotage our own progress. Think about your own moments of hesitation, whether pausing before hitting submit on an application, negotiating a raise, or even just investing in yourself. What voices hover? Where did your self-imposed limits originate? Sometimes, the why lingers far behind, encoded in childhood, culture, and the complex swirl of emotion attached to each dollar spent or saved. Moving forward, This awareness offers a radical invitation to shine a gentle, fearless light on the roots of your financial identity. Not to blame, but to understand, because only in seeing how the beliefs were planted do you gain the freedom to rewire them. By tracing your threads of doubt or compulsion back to their source, you gain the power to choose anew, breaking cycles that once felt as unyielding as bedrock. This isn't just self-reflection. It's the gateway to a new chapter, one no longer written by someone else's fear or haste. A teenager named Ethan stood on a foggy urban street, sneaker laces undone, reading the neon sign of a pawn shop that glowed against the night. He hadn't planned to walk this way after closing up at the market, but something about the place, known for deals as much as for whispered half-truths, pulled him in. Inside, a wiry man in a flannel shirt appraised each customer with the practiced eye of someone who'd bought more regrets than radios. Ethan's hands slipped in and out of his pockets as he took in the cluttered shelves. He wasn't there to sell anything, at least not yet, but the memory of last week's overdue rent simmered beneath his ribs. As he wandered, he listened to snatches of conversation, a woman bargaining for the family heirloom she'd pawned, a college student seeking cash for a laptop lost in last month's layoff. Their words tumbled with the sound of the old register, each exchange exposing another layer of vulnerability and silent negotiation. Moving on from chance encounters with scarcity, there's a deeper battlefield hidden beneath, society's tales about money, traded and retold like old folk stories. Walking through the city, Ethan saw billboards promising overnight fortunes and heard friends tease each other about making it big. The world around him seemed obsessed with the idea that wealth was either inborn or miraculously earned, rarely mentioning the quiet web spun by discipline, humility, or deferred gratification. The stories etched into media headlines barely matched what Ethan saw in real life. A neighbor scraping by on double shifts, a successful cousin admitting that her breakthrough came only after a decade of failures. Furthermore, as Ethan joined friends for coffee, their conversation turned to which influencer had bought a boat or which app developer had cashed out early. The quick success stories were met with awe or dismissal, but rarely with questions about what truly lay underneath: the sleepless nights, the self-doubt, the small daily sacrifices. It became clear that around the table, many wore invisible armor, protecting themselves from envy, judgment, or the embarrassment of not measuring up. Comparisons were constant, fueling everything from silent ambition to quiet despair. When talk drifted to one girl's startup, which had just folded, the group's support was genuine, but sharp with unspoken relief. At least it wasn't me this time. Beyond these social narratives, Ethan began to notice the subtle myths that had burrowed deep into the city's pulse. There was the belief that if you just worked hard enough, everything would fall into place. Ignoring, of course, the unfair realities stacked against some, luck's unpredictable interference, and the vital role of relationships or timely advice. Some people wore thrift like a badge of honor, chanting, "It's not about what you make, but what you save," as if caution alone could construct a safety net. Others lived by mantras about hustle and risk, convinced that taking leaps without a parachute was the only noble path to prosperity. Ethan realized each group was haunted by their own shadows: fear of missing out, terror of losing what they'd scraped together, suspicion that happiness must be postponed until some magic number appeared. Consequently, these myths wove themselves into daily choices with almost invisible threads. Ethan caught himself buying off-brand groceries he didn't like, just to prove he wasn't wasteful, echoing a myth that equates suffering with virtue. One night, unable to sleep, he dug through old receipts and wondered why every generous gesture, like helping a friend cover their shift, left him worrying about his own future. The stories around him, spoken and unspoken, made him question whether enjoyment and abundance could really exist simultaneously. As he stared at the ceiling, he realized that clinging to these limiting beliefs kept him circling the same anxious thoughts, unable to move forward or trust new opportunities. Another crucial realization arrived when Ethan's older friend, Serena, invited him to her bookshop for a late-night talk. She'd written out decades of booms and busts, each cycle leaving its own set of scars. She shared blunt truths. Forget the stories about overnight success. Real change in money, Just like real change in self means facing the long, narrow roads and getting comfortable with discomfort. Her words reached past Ethan's wariness. They didn't erase the city's myths in one conversation, but for the first time, Ethan sensed that challenging these collective illusions was not only possible, but necessary. So, as dawn began to color the sky outside the pawn shop, Ethan walked home lighter. He wasn't free of fear or uncertainty, but he carried with him a new commitment to rewrite the myths. He decided to question, with curiosity and courage, each story, his own and the ones handed down, one belief at a time. A single lamp flickered above the cluttered kitchen table as Mia bent over her notebook, its pages crowded with hopeful lists and scattered goals. Each column began with the same thought: how to break free from the invisible limits she felt pressing in. Unlike the worn financial advice she'd heard before, tonight Mia yearned for a spark, a real shift that didn't hinge on luck or empty platitudes. Her brother, Caleb, leaned into the doorframe, watching her frustration mount. For as long as he could remember, Mia had carried a secret restlessness, her ambition colliding with some unseen wall. There, in that cramped apartment, a new approach finally started to form, one less about external changes and more about igniting internal transformation. Instead of surrendering to fatigue, Mia decided to map out the smallest actions she could take that very night as a deliberate act of rewiring her thinking. She pulled her favorite mug from the shelf, one chipped, soft blue, a relic from college that made her smile, and filled it with tea, filling the air with gentle, herbal warmth. As the steam curled and rose, she challenged herself to anchor in gratitude, naming even the tiniest things she had managed that day. No grand lists, no forced optimism, just an honest acknowledgement. She'd finished a project at work, paid her phone bill on time, and listened patiently to a friend's troubles. Each note became a stitch in the fabric of her mindset, gradually replacing the automatic focus on what was missing. Across the room, the calendar taunted her with the next round of deadlines. But Mia, determined not to relapse into old patterns, dug into the first exercise she'd learned from a late-night podcast, financial journaling. For the next 15 minutes, she recorded her beliefs about money, not just numbers, but the stories she'd inherited and the emotions they evoked. What emerged surprised her: fear of not measuring up, doubts about her right to invest in herself, and a worry that every step forward might be undone by a single setback, all spilled onto the page. By naming these shadows, Mia began to loosen their grip, glimpsing the edges of beliefs that had operated unchallenged for years. Building on that momentum, Mia started to experiment with visualization, a technique she had quietly dismissed as wishful thinking in the past. Now, however, she closed her eyes and crafted a detailed scene. Herself at her favorite coastal cafe, paying for breakfast with ease, laughing with friends as sunlight streamed in. She lingered in that vision, not as a passive bystander, but as the confident central figure, embodying the version of herself who thrived, not simply survived. This mental rehearsal felt awkward at first, but the more she practiced, the more tangible her future appeared. The boundary between fiction and reality softened, and the unfamiliar sensation of deserved abundance began to seed itself within her. Meanwhile, her brother noticed a subtle but powerful shift over the following days. Mia began embracing small savings challenges, not from a place of deprivation, but with a sense of playfulness. She called it reverse shopping. Every time she resisted an impulse buy, she transferred that amount into her savings, celebrating the decision with a spontaneous dance around the living room. Each success, no matter how tiny, served as undeniable proof that she was actively overturning old patterns. When stress returned, as it inevitably did, Mia no longer defaulted to self-blame. Instead, she checked in with herself, practiced deep breathing, or wrote 3 things she had learned that week, reinforcing her commitment to growth. Suddenly, opportunities that once seemed out of reach started to materialize. A side project turned into extra income. A mentor at work opened new doors. What changed was not the world around Mia, but her willingness to partner practical shifts with internal alignment, allowing gratitude and intention to guide her energy. She nurtured these habits, day by day, trusting that even incremental progress was proof of her expanding power and newfound relationship with money. Through every small act, whether celebrating a victory, reframing a setback, or visualizing a brighter path, Mia felt herself growing into someone capable of handling abundance. With Caleb's encouragement and her own fierce resolve, she learned that inner transformation, rooted in repeated action, was the truest catalyst for lasting change. The apartment felt lighter, charged with possibility, as if every small step had quietly rewritten the story of what she believed and what she could become. Late autumn sunlight filtered through the cracks of the old neighborhood gym as Victor laced his running shoes with deliberate care. This wasn't just another workout. Each morning, he showed up before dawn, not to sculpt muscle, but to carve out another version of himself, one that could hold both authority and vulnerability without apology. For years, Victor played the role of the steadfast provider, the sibling who picked up extra shifts, the friend who quietly paid for dinners, the neighbor everyone leaned on in emergencies. No one knew how often his confidence crumpled when faced with decisions bigger than a grocery budget. Today, though, a new possibility flickered through his mind. What if he could become someone who didn't just survive under pressure, but thrived, commanding not just resources, but self-respect? Shuffling in beside Victor, Nate adjusted his headset and grinned. "Man, you ever feel like you're hustling just to stay even?" he asked. Victor managed a laugh, but the question struck deeper than he admitted. He'd always equated responsibility with self-sacrifice, never questioning where his sense of worth truly came from. Watching Nate glide through problem after problem with a kind of playful resilience, Victor started to notice an underlying difference. Nate's choices didn't spring from a place of scarcity or guilt. They radiated a quiet conviction, as if he'd made peace with the unpredictable and claimed his own narrative. Victor realized in that moment that their divergence wasn't about luck or knowledge. It was a product of identity. Pushing through his lapse, Victor reconsidered what he'd always believed about leadership. Previously, he'd thought sound management was just a matter of balancing money, time, or people. Now, emerging from the locker room and catching his reflection in a smudged mirror, another dimension appeared. Authentic leadership meant staking a claim to an internal self-concept regardless of circumstances. This shift was subtle but profound. It neither ignored reality nor numbed struggle. Instead, it reimagined who he was at the root, someone who could direct resources, shape opportunity, and own mistakes without being defined by them. Later that week, Victor sat at a local cafe, flipping through resumes and invoices between sips of strong black coffee. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, blending with city chatter. The clarity he gained at the gym persisted. He drafted a bold, precise email requesting a much-needed raise, something he'd resisted for years out of fear of seeming ungrateful or overambitious. Each word he typed reflected not desperation, but a new allegiance to the belief that his abilities deserved recognition, that stewardship of money could align with purpose, not just obligation. When he finally pressed send, it wasn't the potential rejection that scared him. It was the weight of doing what, deep down, he'd always thought was off-limits. Surprisingly, the response was not just positive, but gushing with respect for his initiative and candor. Far from being dismissed or shamed, Victor found his integrity, born of struggle, shaped by countless small wins and setbacks, was exactly what made him invaluable. His boss remarked, "It's refreshing to see someone take ownership and stand up for fair value." For the first time, Victor glimpsed how embracing a new identity could ripple outward. By holding himself worthy, he gave others permission to do the same. The effects spilled over into friendships, too. Instead of hiding financial anxieties behind humor or stoic silence, Victor began discussing goals and roadblocks openly, discovering camaraderie in shared aspiration and problem-solving rather than mutual complaint. Gradually, being counted on ceased to feel like a burden and transformed into a profound sense of stewardship. Victor no longer conflated decisiveness with arrogance, nor humility with shrinking back. With each decision, whether approving a budget, planning a family milestone, or even treating himself to something once deemed too much, he reclaimed the narrative of what abundance meant. Prosperity was no longer a distant reward for enduring hardship, but an extension of lived integrity. Purpose, once tethered to duty, now anchored itself in vision, an ongoing commitment to rise and lead, first for himself, then for the community he touched each day. In the closing moments of a long night, Victor gazed at the city lit up with opportunity and complexity. The view was less intimidating now. He finally understood. Real abundance flows out from within, and true mastery over money starts with the courage to reimagine who you are and what you stand for. That new self, grown in the crucible of daily choices, was the foundation for everything that lay ahead. The rain pulsed against the cracked window pane as Elise flicked off her office lamp, the world outside awash in charcoal and gold. At this hour, the building's echo amplified every footstep, punctuating her decision to stay late. Tonight was different. A restlessness rippled through her. She felt the weight of every choice that had brought her to this narrow intersection of desire and discipline. In her hands, she cradled a battered hardcover journal, a recent gift from her aunt, a woman whose own financial rise had always seemed shrouded in quiet certainty. The journal's cover was etched with a quote about reinvention, though Elise barely noticed. Instead, she stared at the blank page with a mounting awareness that she was on the brink of something she couldn't quite name. A rush of memories surfaced as she began to write. The first time she'd negotiated a salary, her words trembling, and the darting glance she gave her supervisor when she hesitated before speaking up. That moment, so seemingly small, had marked a pivot. Rather than succumb to a routine of passivity, she'd made an initial, awkward stand for herself, a step that had closed the gap just enough to taste autonomy. What surfaced now, however, was a new realization, forged in the silence of these late hours. Identity alone could not sustain her. To fundamentally change her relationship with money and thrive, she had to revisit, and ultimately recode, the very programming beneath her actions. Leaning back, Elise resolved to anchor something deeper into her psyche. She slid her eyes shut, conjuring a practice she'd avoided for years, actual guided visualization. With the dim hum of the city below, she pictured not just earning, saving, or spending, but the intricate emotional circuitry each act triggered. What would it mean to live in alignment, not merely attain occasional windfalls? In her mind's eye, she imagined stepping into a sunlit room filled with voices of her past, teachers, friends, critics, each urging her toward one pattern or another. This time, though, she allowed herself to walk past them, forward, until their voices blurred into background music. The space shifted, brightening as she embraced a clear image of herself freely investing, negotiating, giving, all in accordance with her core values and not old fears. With every breath, she rewrote the script her mind had practiced in loops. You don't deserve, became. You select and steward with wisdom. It was stunning how even brief minutes of this exercise catalyzed a subtle but tangible shift in her posture. The sense of possibility expanded, like sunlight peeling back heavy clouds. Internally, Elise knew that a single episode of visualization would not transform decades of ingrained beliefs. Yet the repetition, 10 minutes before sleep, again on her morning commute, acted as fertilizer for desired change. The patterns she practiced behind closed eyes began to bleed into her actual behaviors. Greater patience during stressful calls, a reluctance to automatically self-reject opportunities, and a newly found habit of pausing before making quick, scarcity-driven decisions. Reprogramming, she concluded, was less revolution and more gentle gardening, pulling up the weeds of former narratives, planting something more congruent, and tending it with daily acts of trust. On tough days, she noticed it was the ritual, not the result, that mattered. Recording each small win, she added another line to her journal. Today, I tried again. At her next family dinner, Elise overheard a cousin talking about a major financial setback. How he'd started over at 40, piecing together his life with little beyond persistence and recalibrated purpose. He spoke not with regret, but with a quiet reverence for the process of self-reinvention. You keep showing up, he said. That's the contract you make with yourself. As his words lingered, Elise recognized a resonance in her own heart. This commitment was not about erasing vulnerability or masquerading as perfect, but about returning, day after day, to the emotional and practical work of alignment. By night's end, She realized she had begun to view her journey not as a linear ascent, but as an ever-deepening spiral, each revolution offering another chance to upgrade what she believed, how she behaved, and, ultimately, what she could build. The rain finally slowed, tracing delicate patterns across glass. Elise gathered her things, feeling strangely lighter. Commitment had taken on a new flavor, steady, hopeful, rooted in long-term resonance. No longer was she only reacting to past pain. She was quietly, bravely composing a new harmony with every mindful step forward. Reflecting on this journey so far, you might sense an undercurrent stirring, a gentle but insistent pulse, echoing with each quiet revelation. What at first appeared to be scattered fragments of thought or feeling now feels strangely interwoven, as though disparate roots have slowly entwined beneath the surface, binding themselves into surprising strength. The air is charged, as if some invisible storm has passed, not with violent force, but with the kind of rainfall that nourishes seeds buried in the darkest earth. New growth is inevitable, even if still unseen. Picture for a moment an old, winding river, one that has, over endless years, picked up silt from every hewn valley, every forest it has touched. No matter how still its surface may seem, that water is forever shaped by the paths it has carved, the tributaries it has joined, and the storms it has endured. The river does not return quite the same as it once was. It accumulates memories of the land, its depth growing with each bend and confluence. In the same way, each small act, each tiny decision or quiet moment of insight has begun to reshape the inner landscape, inviting you to inhabit your own story with fresh intention. There is a strange beauty in the way these once isolated moments of doubt, bravery, and self-reflection now flow together, like musical phrases building to a deeper harmony. You may notice, too, how the mind resists closure, wanting to linger at the edge of the unfamiliar simply because it feels safer there. And yet, something persistent draws you forward, a new curiosity, or perhaps a quiet readiness. It is the sense that, beneath all the layers you have gently peeled back, an authentic momentum is gathering, as if the scaffolding for something strong and enduring has already been set in place. Ben, emerging from the twilight-lit library, felt the shift in his chest before he could name it. It was not a finale, but the trembling before the overture, a realization that he was standing at the threshold of a different season. He moved with less hesitation, every step guided by something subtler than logic. Even the familiar cityscape, a tangle of old street lamps and shimmering storefronts, seemed to hold more promise, as though the mundane had been subtly rewired. He remembered the questions that used to circle relentlessly, the patterns that clung like shadows, and marveled at his newfound willingness simply to exist with them. Now, instead of searching for imminent resolution, he let himself rest in the generative space just before dawn, where possibility flickers most brightly. The silence of a kitchen after midnight, a bus ride through blurry rain, a heartbeat steadied by breath. These are the places where transformation brews. Conversations both internal and shared hang in the air, paradoxically heavy and weightless. There is no urgent clarity yet, but a gathering of strands, a tapestry in progress, not fully revealed. It is the way a violinist's final note hovers before applause, or a climber pauses on a ledge before reaching for the last hold. The sensation of balance, of time suspended, as every accumulated experience aligns in anticipation. In these rare intervals, when you neither flee nor force the next step, you cultivate the soil for deep, lasting change. The road ahead feels less daunting now, not because the challenges have evaporated, but because you have begun to sense the resourcefulness rising from within. Here, in the hush between what has shifted and what is about to be claimed, your story is quietly rewriting itself. This is not resolution. It is the moment the artist steps back from the canvas, brush still wet, breath caught in expectancy. And in that pause, where past textures blend with the colors of new desire, the contours of your emerging identity begin to sharpen. The familiar boundaries of circumstance have softened. What was once a tangled web of internal conflict and old narratives now feels like fertile ground, brimming with the latent energy of what might be realized next. As you lean into this quiet, charged space, Let yourself perceive the subtle architecture blossoming beneath your feet. The path ahead is not yet mapped. Its shape defined only by the choices you are now willing to consider. The next step will ask for presence, a trust in the process, and perhaps, most of all, a willingness to believe that you are being quietly prepared for an arrival that has already begun to unfold. That evening, as dusk folded silently around the city, a hush seemed to settle over everything. Lena leaned on her apartment's narrow balcony, gaze tracing the tangled glow of taillights winding far below. The world felt impossibly vast, a living patchwork of uncertainty and longing, hope pulsing quietly against the hum of reality. She watched the wind tug at tree branches, dislodging the last golden leaves, and allowed herself to exhale fully, something she hadn't realized she'd been holding back for years. Her phone buzzed softly by her side, messages waiting, family requests, work inquiries, half-remembered reminders. She ignored them, just for a moment, drawn to the curious peace blooming in her chest. Inside, the remnants of her day, the mug beside the bed, a notebook splayed with aspirations and mistakes, faded bills tucked beneath a half-finished novel, felt less like evidence of struggle and more like testament to her existence as a becoming. Some quiet, insistent truth was beginning to crystallize. The idea that her value, her destiny, was not defined by the ebb and flow of money, not dictated by the feverish pace of comparison, not imprisoned by the ache of what she once lacked. She recalled the stories that shaped her: a grandfather who laughed freely even when budgets tightened, a friend who taught her that generosity held its own kind of wealth, the neighbor who lost, then rebuilt, and did so with unflagging imagination rather than bitterness. A sudden memory surfaced, herself as a child, face upturned in a heavy storm, laughing as the rain drenched her hair and clothes, unconcerned with consequence or scarcity. She'd been so utterly present, so alive to sensation and possibility. And now, years later, she recognized that this, too, was available to her. The capacity to stand in her truth, to let abundance be measured not only in numbers, but in resilience, in kindness, in the willingness to keep moving forward even when the sky turned uncertain. She gathered her things for the night, smoothing the last page of her journal between careful fingers. The city lights throbbed rhythmically through the curtains, reminding her that outside this small, sacred space, lives continued to unfold, some in triumph, some in uncertainty, all in their own intricate dance with hope. Her mind drifted to tomorrow, to the endless churn and possibility it held. Perhaps progress would be slow. Sometimes doubt would return, echoing the old stories. But a new perspective grounded her. She was no longer living for approval or out of fear's narrow corridors, but stepping gently, deliberately, into the story she was still writing. Before turning away from the window, she pressed her palm to the cool glass and whispered, half promise, half invitation, "Let me trust the process. Let me be present. Let me lead myself forward, no matter how hesitant my steps." And in that quiet, she realized that financial freedom, like any true self-mastery, might never feel absolute or final. But it would always be possible, in the space between letting go and reaching out, in the courage to risk vulnerability for the sake of a fuller, more honest life. That night, sleep came less as escape and more as arrival, into a world not free from struggle, but lush with meaning, connection, and the adrenaline rush of each new beginning. For in the end, it was never just about the money. It was about the becoming, the radical choosing, the luminous act of insisting on worth and possibility again and again. And as everything faded into the softness of early dreams, Lena sensed that, perhaps for the first time, she truly believed in her own unfolding story.